Health insurance companies want you to believe that healthcare in our country is so expensive because of things like innovation, complexity of care, and the overall cost of labor. But that just simply isn't true. As a matter of fact, if you look at labor costs between physicians, nurses, and all other staff that provide direct patient care, that only makes up approximately 18 to 20% of overall healthcare costs in our country. The truth is that there are massive corporations that are extracting billions of dollars from the system that provide no clinical value to patients. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Most people have never even heard of these companies. They're called pharmacy benefit managers, or simply PBMs. Today, we're going to talk about where PBMs even came from. Then we're going to talk about the three big companies that essentially dominate our entire healthcare system, the tactics that they use to extort patients in our country. And then finally, we're going to talk about what the private market as well as governments are doing to fight back against them. I'm Dr. Nolan Fisher. This is Second Opinions. Let's get into the episode. So where did PBMs come from? If we go all the way back into the 1960s, this was when they were first invented. At this time, a lot of employer-sponsored healthcare programs started covering prescription drugs. And the way they would cover them is that you would go to the pharmacy, you would get that prescription filled, and you would pay for it, and then you would submit to the insurance company to get your refund for that medication. The pharmacy benefit managers were essentially administrative companies that served as the middleman in this situation. So they would help people get rebates faster or get their insurance money faster for their medications. And then they would handle this administrative task for the insurance companies to make it easier for them. They essentially charged a small fee and they had no power over our healthcare system. And that's how it was for years until we got to essentially the 1990s. In the 1990s, computer systems started to really take over the pharmacies, and as a result of this, they started to get significantly more data available. By linking the pharmacies together and collecting this aggregated data, they were able to see what kind of usage patterns existed for different medications. And then another thing they could do was actually confirm if your insurance would cover that medication at the point of sale, which wasn't always done before. That was something you had to wait to see. It was at this point when they had all that data and then the power to negotiate between the pharmaceutical companies, the pharmacies, and the insurance companies that they realized they could use their leverage. And the way they did this was by introducing something called formularies. Formularies determine which drugs are covered by your insurance, and then they created a system of tiering where the cheapest medications would be tier 1. You'd have access to those. And then for higher tier medications, oftentimes you'd need approval or prior authorization to get those covered. Additionally, they figured out in order to get the drug manufacturers to get preferential tiers on those formularies, they could demand a discount. And this was when they really started to use their leverage. In 1993, Merck, who was one of the largest, if not the largest, drug manufacturer in the world at that time, bought a company called Medco, who was the largest PBM in our country at that time. They weren't the only ones to do that. At the same time, there was Eli Lilly, who bought a PBM that was called PCS Health Systems. So there was multiple of these drug manufacturers that realized if they didn't have access or potentially own those PBMs, they were going to be in a lot of trouble because the PBMs held so much leverage over them. And this attracted the regulators big time. I actually went out and found the FTC report on when Merck acquired Medco and what their thinking was. And the FTC, once they saw this happen, they were monitoring it and they actually ended up going after Merck. So I have the filing in front of me and it says, according to the FTC, when Merck acquired Medco in late 1993, it became the first pharmaceutical manufacturer to vertically integrate into the then relatively new business of pharmacy benefit management. Since then, several others happened, like we talked about. And then it said at that time, the commission pledged to monitor the industry carefully and cautioned that it might take further action if it concluded that there were signs of anti-competitive conduct in the industry. And that's exactly what happened. So there's a quote here from the director of the FTC's Bureau of Competition. He said, "Our investigation into the PBM industry has revealed that Merck's acquisition of Medco has reduced competition in the market for pharmaceutical products. We have found that Medco was given favorable treatment to Merck drugs. As a result, in some cases, consumers have been denied access to the drugs of competing manufacturers. In addition, the merger has made it possible for Medco to share with Merck sensitive pricing information it gets from Merck's competitors, which could foster collusion among drug manufacturers. The settlement that we have reached with the companies addresses these consequences of the acquisition to ensure lower prices, better quality, and greater choice for consumers." And this was very effective. The FTC continued to go after these companies. And so these large drug manufacturers, they were forced to get rid of the PBMs. So by 2000, the pharmaceutical companies were out of the PBM business. So how did we get to where we are today? Because in the 90s, there was approximately 1.79 distinct PBMs that operated at the same time in our country. And then over the course of 30 years through mergers and acquisitions, that has basically gone down to just a few remaining large companies and then a couple extra that aren't really big players at all. So we have three dominant companies. There's CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum Rx. Those three PBMs control over 80% of all prescription drug claims in our country. When you look at it, because of insurance companies not operating in every state and every area of each state, 82% of all U.S. markets for the PBMs are so highly concentrated that they essentially act as a monopoly in that area. Not only did all of this consolidation lead to three major PBMs that were essentially acting as monopolies in their own each individual areas, but this became much worse in 2006 whenever CVS merged with Caremark, which created this acquisition, vertical integration chain of events that happen to get us to where we are today. I'm going to show you something here that explains our current PBM healthcare type system. So I have a complex chart pulled up here to explain the vertical business relationships among these companies, but basically the big three here are CVS, and we'll start with them. Their CVS is the parent company, and they own Aetna, who's the insurer. They also own CVS Caremark, which is the PBM. So they're negotiating with the insurers and the pharmacies. They also own the specialty pharmacy, CVS Pharmacy. And then on top of that, they own a bunch of different healthcare clinics as well. And we can see the same thing with United Health Group, who's also massive. They have United Healthcare, which is the insurer. They have the PBM, which is Optum Rx. And then they actually own some specialty pharmacies. And then third one, of course, would be the Cigna Group, which has Cigna Healthcare. They own Express Scripts, who's the PBM. And then, of course, they have a bunch of different pharmacies and provider services below them. So you've basically taken the three PBMs, which have monopolized local markets, and they control over 80% of healthcare in our country, and they're all run by the same companies. They're not negotiating with other companies. They're just simply all working together in a individualized monopoly that's vertically integrated. And that's why they're able to take so much money out of the system. The craziest part about this is if you look at the commercial drug prescription plans that most of us have, 77% of them are run through one of these companies. And then if you look at the Medicare Part D programs, 88% of them are run through one of these companies. And so they're not negotiating, the PBM is not negotiating with the insurer or the pharmacy because they're all the same company. So they're just moving money around to make it look as advantageous for them. And of course, charge everybody more. The way that they're charging everybody more, though, that's where it gets really disgusting. And let's talk about the two predatory ways that they basically drive the profits of these companies. The first way they do this is through prescription rebates. And this is essentially just extortion for the drug companies. We talked about before how formularies have those preferred tiers Well, of course, drug manufacturers want their drugs to get on one of the lower tiers so more people will use their drug and they'll make more money. In order to get on those preferred tiers, what the PBM will say to the drug manufacturer is that you have to provide a rebate or a discount. And they call this a retroactive rebate. The PBMs will make the argument then that they're going to get their people the medication for cheaper. If there's a $100 medication and the PBM negotiates with the manufacturer and says, you need to give us a $50 rebate so we can get that to our people for $50, they will then keep or pocket a portion of that rebate, which it's bad enough that they're keeping a portion of this rebate that's supposed to go to their customers or the patient. But what it incentivizes them to do is actually worse. You see, because they keep a percentage of a rebate, they're actually incentivized for the cost of the medication to be more expensive. So that way they can give a bigger rebate, which will allow them to keep a larger percentage of that rebate and more money in their pocket. So for example, if we have two brands that have a medication and they're competing against one another to be on a formulary and they want to be on a low tier, let's say brand A has a list price of their medication that is $1,000, but they negotiate a 50% rebate. That means that the price of the medication would then be $500, we'll say $500 per month. If the PBM gets to keep 4% of that, then they get to keep $20 of that medication. However, if they do that same 50% rebate on medication or brand B, which the list price is $1,200, then they get a $600 rebate. The cost of the prescription to the consumer or the patient is $600, and the PBM actually makes $24, which is more money. So you can tell right now that their incentive is for medications to be more expensive. So the rebate game itself is disgusting. You can see how the perverse incentives sit there to run up the cost of all medications for us. And that's largely why a lot of medications in our country are so expensive and getting more expensive, even though they're old medications. But the second thing they do is essentially shaking down local pharmacies through something that's called spread pricing. And as we saw before, these PBMs, a lot of them like CVS, they own their own pharmacies. So they obviously gives great deals for negotiating with them. But with local pharmacies, that's not the case. You see, the PBM sits as this middleman between the prescription plans, right, the insurers and the local pharmacies. So the PBM will go to the insurer and say, hey, for your patients to get this medication, it's going to cost $100. And then let's say it costs $100 a month. Then they will go to the pharmacy, and let's say it's some local pharmacy. They'll say, we're going to give you $10 a month to get this medication to our patients. And then they keep that $90 in between. And the big issue here is that not only do they get to pocket this huge amount of, $90 out of that $100, but a lot of times they are paying these local pharmacies so little that these local pharmacies are actually losing money on these medications. And the result has been that it's driving a lot of these local pharmacies completely out of business. Additionally, when these local pharmacies can't fill that medication, what do? They steer the patients to their own pharmacy, therefore increasing the amount of people that are using their own pharmacies and putting those local pharmacies out of business. These companies, however, haven't stopped here. Of course, there's been scrutiny from the FTC, federal regulators, state regulators as well. So they've actually started something that are called group purchasing organizations, which they strategically place outside of our country, so that way they can't be looked at and scrutinized. And they use the money that they're making from the spread pricing. They actually run that through these group purchasing organizations, these GPOs, and they hide billions of dollars of profit by doing that. So what's the impact of these tactics that they're using? Not only are they making things more expensive, they're also putting rural pharmacies out of business. So between 2013 and 2022, about 10% of all rural pharmacies went out of business. And in many of these locations, that local pharmacy was the only pharmacy within quite a way from these rural towns. Additionally, prescriptions in our country have gotten so expensive that even cheap prescriptions, or ones that used to be cheap, have gotten so expensive that people are not using their medications as they're supposed to. And there was a study that was done on this where they said essentially 3 in 10 people were rationing or not using their life-saving medications. And by rationing, just meaning they aren't taking it as often as they should because they've gotten so expensive. And these two things are why medications look so expensive. When you see list prices for medications that are hundreds or thousands of dollars, and you're wondering why that price is so high compared to the actual cost of the medication, or there's medications that are generic that are even expensive. Those generic medications can oftentimes cost pennies to make. It's because of this. It's because of what they're doing here in order to intentionally drive up the prices. Well, it's taken longer than in the 90s, whenever the FTC came down on the drug manufacturers and the PBMs. The federal government is really starting to get aggressive, as well as state governments, and they're doing a lot of intervention here. And most recently, in 2026, there was this new law that was passed. It was the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2026, and this was probably the most difficult piece of legislation for PBMs in history. And I want to take a look at just the major points of this. There's essentially 4 key takeaways. The first one is definitely the most significant. It was that starting in January of 2028, contracts between Medicare Part D sponsors, which are, Medicare Advantage plans and Medicare drug costs, and pharmacy benefit managers acting on sponsors' behalf must ensure that PBMs are prohibited from deriving remuneration from drug rebates, spread pricing, or volume-based arrangements, and only receive a flat fee, bona fide service fees at fair market value for the services that they performed. PBMs contracted with group health plans will similarly need to remit to plans any rebates, fees, alternative discounts, and other remuneration received relating to utilization of drugs or drug spending. So basically here, the first takeaway is that these PBMs, they can no longer do the drug rebate game. They can no longer do the spread pricing, and they can no longer set up these volume-based arrangements with different pharmacies in order to run up the drug price. So these 2 tactics are out. The second takeaway is that PBMs, they must submit annual detailed reports beginning in 2028 to both the drug plan sponsors and to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid that disclose what type of rebates are happening, what the reimbursement rates are to different pharmacies, the pharmacy arrangements that they have, and they are essentially setting them up to be more strictly audited. So that way there's more clarity as to where the money's going, how much each pharmacy is getting paid, and if they are in fact steering people to their own pharmacies or taking advantage of small pharmacies. The third takeaway is that the CMS has the authority to essentially have significantly more harsh financial penalties for these PBM violations. And then key takeaway number 4 is that essentially by 2029, any one of these PBMs that are dealing with Medicare in any way, they have to bring all pharmacies into their networks at reasonable rates. They can't extort these smaller pharmacies for the preference of their own pharmacy. And really the big thing here is that all the negotiated savings that these PBMs have been getting and essentially funneling into their own pockets through the offshore companies and such, they're going to have to pass through all those discounts on to the customers or the patients. At the same time, there was also a recent FTC lawsuit that happened where they went after Express Scripts, and it was for these GPOs, which were the offshore companies that were essentially funneling money through. And what it says here, as far as those GPOs go, the PBM contracts with employers and unions typically require that rebates received from drug manufacturers be passed through the client. All or most of them. For years, reformers in Congress and the FTC have pushed to strengthen and enforce those pass-through requirements. While multiple regulatory and legislative proposals would prohibit manufacturers from paying PBMs administrative service fees based on a percentage of sales or drug list prices, there's no parallel effort to alter GPO safe harbor rules. GPOs are compensated via manufacturer-paid administrative fees, typically computed as a percentage of the purchase price. Rebate reform doesn't touch GPO fees. If you can reclassify what used to be a rebate as a GPO administrative fee, you've moved the money to a different bucket. One your clients can't claim, one regulators haven't regulated, and one that if it sits offshore, they can't easily scrutinize. Manufacturers paid an estimated $7.6 billion in these fees to rebate aggregators in 2022 alone. 2 of the 3 big PBM GPOs are located in Europe, where they can avoid scrutiny and oversight by US lawmakers and regulators. And early this year in 2026, the FTC went after Express Scripts. There was a big settlement that happened that said, hey, you have to be transparent about what's going on here, and you can't do this game where you're just essentially placing those rebates in a different bucket and pocketing the money. And individual states are doing the same thing. The other PBMs are all trying to work together now so that way they don't end up in the same situation. And it seems like there's going to be significantly more legislation that happens for going after this specific thing right here. So that's what the government is doing. But what about the private marketplace? So if you've seen anything about this, it's probably been from Mark Cuban with his new company that's called Cost Plus Drugs. Cost Plus Drugs essentially is a cash-only pharmacy. They buy generic medications directly from manufacturers at the manufactured cost, which is significantly lower, and then they only mark up that cost 15% to cover their overall running their business, and then they do a $5 fee for the pharmacy work that goes in, and then they charge a shipping fee that's usually around $5 as well. By doing this model, they can essentially drop the cost of most drugs by approximately 90%. So we look here, one of the ones I've pulled up is atorvastatin, which is just the generic Lipitor. This is one of the most common medications taken in our country. It helps lower your cholesterol, keep your heart safe, has been used for years and years and years, and is very common. If you look, we scroll down here, you see that the drug price with them, they say is $5.26, and that retail prices at other pharmacies is $55.20. So you're saving $49.94 on your medication. And then they actually give the breakdown of what's coming, where the cost is coming from here. So 22 cents is actually the manufacturing the medication. Their 15% markup on those 22 cents is 3 cents. The pharmacy labor is $5, and then standard shipping they estimate is about $5.25, which changes varying on where you're located and when you need the shipping, right? Another thing that happened here is Trump RX. So this is run by the federal government, of course, but what they're trying to do is have access and organize all of the Cost Plus Drugs and other companies into one system that anyone can browse through and find what the cheapest cost of their medication is. And they give some examples here of like insulin, for example, where a pen of this type of insulin is $1,450 per month. You know, it's typically like per pen, so that's about a month maybe. In Germany, that's $310. You see these medications are way cheaper in other places. And then they've essentially negotiated the price down to where our price is significantly more affordable. They're using this as a central database to where you could essentially type in any medication and see if you can get it at a much cheaper cash price. They started off when they launched this, I think it was in February. There's maybe 20 medications on there, and most people felt like it wasn't going to be anything significant. And now there's over 800 medications in just the first 4 months. And it's a lot of everyday drugs. You know, it's the blood pressure drugs like lisinopril, it's blood thinners like clopidogrel, and then, like I said, you know, atorvastatin. These are drugs that are used widely by so many people. So saving money can really be impactful here. And then, of course, they have the weight loss drugs on here. So $1,300 for a pen of Wegovy, or $1,300 for a month worth of Wegovy pills. And those are $149 per month or $199 per month. There's other companies too, you know, it doesn't just send to Cost Plus Drugs. You know, there's Amazon Pharmacy, there's GoodRx, there's a lot of other places that are getting in this cash only game because they realize that there's an opportunity there and it's something that's needed. And this is just serving as essentially like an aggregator of all those prices into one place. So that's what the government's doing. That's what private companies are doing. But the real question is, what can you and I do, right? What can we do to fight back against this and not get just completely taken advantage of for our medications? And I would say the first thing here is just to stop playing their game. If you go get a medication and you see the cost of it and it seems like it's over expensive, you should always ask what the cash price is. And then you can always check things like Trump RX or Cost Plus Drugs or Amazon Pharmacy and see what the discount you can get there and how much money you could save. Additionally, you can bypass the insurance entirely by going to direct primary care doctors where you're just paying simply cash pay for primary care. And they oftentimes have ways that they can get the medications for much cheaper as well. If you're a business owner, you can actually do this with your company. You can take out higher deductible insurance plans. And a lot of times you can actually work with groups of direct primary care physicians to take care of your employees and their families at a much cheaper rate. This is oftentimes way more cost effective than just using traditional insurance. And really here, the truth is that every time you don't run money through these PBMs and these insurers and their associated pharmacies, you're draining them of resources and you're making it more difficult for them in the future. And you're also allowing these companies like Cost Plus Drugs to show that they work, which will encourage more cash pay systems in the future and bring down more affordable drugs. And then finally, of course, it goes without saying, if you're active in politics, make sure to remind your politicians that this is an important issue for them and, vote accordingly. So that's it. That's the brief overview of PBMs, what they're doing to drive up the cost of our healthcare, to drive up the cost of our drug prices, and just basically the unethical, illegal practices that they're doing to make billions of dollars. Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments. I'm Dr. Nolan Fisher. This is Second Opinions. I'll see you next week.